Travel all over the countryside, ask the Leylands, ask the Leylands. Travel all over the countryside, ask the Leyland brothers. Whatever it is that you want to see, ask the Leylands, ask the Leylands. No matter whatever that happens to be, ask the Leyland brothers. Come on, me in and join in the fun, travel all over Australia.
Port Stephens in New South Wales, just north of Newcastle here, is reputed to be the best place in New South Wales for growing oysters. And we're going to have a look at the growing of oysters and where they spawn.
And then we're off to Queensland, to Yeppoon here. There we meet a man who has a very interesting collection of seashells. Keppel Bay is one of the best places for collecting seashells, and we go out and see how he gets them.
Then up into the Northern Territory to Norlangie to have a look at the famous Norlangie rock paintings and some burial caves there. Glenn McMurdo of Albion Park, New South Wales, would like us to show him how oysters are grown. This is Moffat's oyster barn near Karua and Port Stephens in New South Wales. Bill Moffat has been growing oysters for most of his life and had leases in Port Stephens for most of that time. Oysters are grown on sawn timber, nailed together about 25mm apart. Thousands of these racks are made for each spawning season. The racks are dipped in tar to prolong the life of the wood and give the young oysters a good surface to grip onto. The Japanese were first to cultivate oysters as early as 2000 BC. Serious cultivation in Australia began much later in 1870 on the Georges River in Sydney. The Aborigines knew the value of the oyster and enjoyed them gathered from the rocks along the New South Wales coast. Carbon dating of shell middens in New South Wales has shown the Aborigines ate oysters as far back as 6000 BC. Bill Moffat takes us in his cruiser to see the spawning areas at Salamander Bay in Port Stephens. Salamander is the best and biggest oyster spawning area in New South Wales. 90% of cultivated oysters come from here. Some stay here to grow and others are shipped to other growing areas, such as the Hawkesbury River. The spawning of the oysters is a completely natural process and takes place in the summer months. The growing oysters further up the bay from Salamander spawn and the eggs are fertilised in the water. Soon the eggs develop into free-swimming microscopic larvae. In the next 2 to 3 weeks, the larvae drift in and out of the bays and estuaries on the tidal currents. They end up here in Salamander Bay, where they attach themselves to the dark undersides of thousands of these stick racks. Here they grow their protective shells and are known as spats. After 6 months, the racks of spats are moved further into Port Stephens and stacked 3 deep to prevent fish from eating the young oysters. When the oyster is strong enough to withstand predators, the racks are spread out in single layers in lease areas to grow to maturity. It takes about 3 years of careful supervision for an oyster to reach marketable size. The oysters feed on microscopic organisms filtered from the water by its gills. Harvesting is the simple process of collecting the racks in a flat-bottom barge. These plate-size oysters are just over 3 years old and weigh in at about 20 oysters per kilo, or average 50 grams each. If they are left too long and grow too big, the flesh becomes tough and loses its flavour. Flat-bottom barges are used to manoeuvre in between the oyster racks at low tide. It is a simple, if tedious task, to knock the oysters off the sticks to be collected in the barge. Some of the sticks can be reused for another crop. The workboat hauls the load back to the sorting shed. The barge load of oysters is winched out of the water into the sorting shed. Inside the oyster barn, the task of culling and grading takes place. Bill Moffat found he had so many people dropping by to see how oysters are grown that he decided to open his barn to the public. Now you can watch the whole process of grading while your meal of oysters is being prepared. Fresh oysters are expertly opened by a team of men at one end of the oyster barn. The oyster industry in New South Wales is worth $4 million annually and is growing every year. The industry operates with highly efficient cultivation techniques, but still depends on nature for favourable conditions to allow good spawning and growth. Maybe in the future the oyster farmer will be producing fast-growing oysters from a laboratory. But will they taste as good? It is easy to taste the oysters here because Bill has a restaurant area in the oyster barn where you can sample the oysters that you have just seen opened.
Do you do anything like this in Northern England?
Bill Moffat's oyster farm is a bit different from the ordinary because here you can see how it all happens and get to eat some as well.
They really are.
If you don't like oysters from the shell, Bill can serve them up 10 different ways. The humble oyster has been a favourite with man for thousands of years.
Well, we've come to Keppel Bay in Queensland at the suggestion of David Sinclair from Rockhampton in Queensland. He wrote to us suggesting that the habit of collecting shells, which goes on here, might be quite interesting on our program. Well, some people collect very beautiful shells, some of them as big and as nice as this beautiful Bala shell. We're going to join one such collector, Roger Mason, and his wife on a collecting trip across Keppel Bay to the Keppel Island group just off the bay here near Yeppoon in Queensland. The islands of Keppel Bay are said to be amongst the finest in Australian waters for collectors of seashells. As a result, there is a strong shell collecting club in the town of Yeppoon. Roger Mason and his wife Merle have been avid collectors for about 10 years, and they're lucky enough to hold a 20-year lease on a small island of the Keppel group. They spend as much of their spare time as possible taking trips to the island for fishing, relaxing, and enjoying the hobby of shell collecting.
Roger's sons Darryl and Noel are also keen on shell collecting, and almost every weekend finds the family off on an excursion to their own little paradise island.
I often thought, you know, that shells, you pick them up on the beach. And I had a look at a couple of shell collections, and I thought, now, they must get them from somewhere else. So we decided we'd have a look around the island, and one tide was a very big out, so we started to lift a couple of rocks up, and lo and behold, here were these shells. Well, our eyes nearly popped out. We couldn't get over it, so we thought, oh, this is great. So we kept going, and then we learnt that the only way we're going to preserve the area to keep it so that we could shell years ahead was to make sure that all the rocks were turned back the right way, because if you didn't, the sun would burn the algae on top of the rocks and you wouldn't get growth on them for at least 2 years. There's one. After a while we learned that most of the cowries live in amongst the weed and under rocks, and you've got to get them on a tide that goes fairly well out, because they don't like being out of the water for very long. And so therefore we started to look for cowries for a start, and then after a while we started to pay attention onto other shells, and we'd walk along the rocks, and when we'd come onto sandy patches, and we'd find balers just coming out of the sand on the turn of the tide.
Oh, what a beauty. There should be more around here like that. He said it like yeah, lovely. Same stuff. Really lovely. Yeah, my clean up. Right. Isn't it a beauty now? Yeah, lovely.
When we first started collecting shells, we thought, oh, this is great. We used to find quite a lot of common shells, and after a while we became selective, and because we already had those shells, so now we just go out there and we just concentrate on ones we haven't got many of, and the perfect ones. We leave most of the shells. We might only go out of a weekend and only pick up one shell all weekend, and so that way you can keep the shells out there breeding and you're not destroying the area as well.
The Mason's Island Paradise seems a most delightful place to indulge in a hobby such as shell collecting. But like all collectors, the Masons get their biggest thrill of adding to the collection and admiring them with friends at their home in Yeppoon.
And it's a family hobby, you know. Once your family gets interested in it, it takes up all your spare time, and it's a real good hobby, and helps keep the family together too. You know, they all get an interest in it, and it makes good family living.
Many enjoyable hours are spent poring over the large collection, discussing the various types of shells. These murex shells are found only in the rocky sections, which are pounded by heavy seas and in thick seaweed. They seem to be able to take the rough weather. Some of these are difficult to get and quite rare. When the Masons have several good ones, they write to other collectors throughout the world and exchange their best spare shells for rare shells from other waters. The shiny surface of the cowrie shells is the natural finish on the shell. They're not polished or lacquered in any way. And to get such a shiny finish, the shells must be taken live. This golden cowrie is quite rare and comes from Fiji. Roger traded 2 of his rarest local shells for it. The giant abalone shell comes from Canada, where the abalone grows to about 3 times the size of the Australian variety. The black-coloured cowrie shells are peculiar to Keppel Bay and are very valuable. Some of the most expensive would fetch $80 to $90 if sold to overseas collectors. These cowries are known as arabicas, and the normal colouring is light brownish, like the one on the left. The black colouring appears to be associated with a type of feed in the area. For Roger Mason and his family, shell collecting is an absorbing and rewarding pastime.
Like a huge sentinel, Norlangie Rock rises above the surrounding Buffalo Plains. Part of the Arnham Land escarpment, Norlangie is 200 kilometres east of Darwin. We are here to answer a request from Linda Johnson of Burnie in Tasmania. Linda says, "I am very interested in Aboriginal art and relics. There are some lovely drawings just out from Darwin on the Arnham Land border. I haven't been there and would love to see them." Well, Linda, the area you are asking about is Norlangie Rock and is situated in the proposed Kakadu National Park. This area is only accessible to four-wheel drive vehicles. These are the famous Norlangie Rock cave paintings that a lot of people come out here to have a look at. They were touched up in 1961 by the keeper of the cave, Barramundi Charlie. We were told that this represents Barramundi Charlie's wives, and that up there is Barramundi Charlie himself. He was the head man, and he had all these wives. He painted them a long time ago when he was a young man. And to the right of Barramundi Charlie is the lightning spirit. And on his knee there you can see a little axe. That's supposed to be when the lightning hits, the axe cuts the tree down. Each tribe has a Barramundi Charlie, who is represented in these paintings by a man with a fish-shaped head. The Barramundi Charlies of the different tribes were responsible for looking after the cave paintings and touching them up from time to time. Norlangie's Barramundi Charlie died in the 1960s. He was the last of his tribe, so now there is no guardian of the paintings. On the western side of the escarpment, not far from Norlangie, is Nangalore Cave, which is richly adorned with Mimi figures. The Mimi are supposed to represent self-portraits of fairy-like creatures that live in rock crevices. They are so thin and fragile that the wind could break their bones, so they only come out on calm days. Their hearing is so acute that no one can sneak up on them. Thus nobody, including the Aborigines, have ever seen a real Mimi. The corrosive effects of time and weather are gradually fading the ochre colours. It's pretty hard to determine the age of the paintings on the rocks here. This one here is obviously pretty old because of the painting itself. It's either a painting of a Macassan prow, which would have been around these waters or in the early 1800s and before that, or a European sailing boat. But it looks like it's got an anchor chain there, so it's more than likely a European sailing boat that came around the Arnham Land area in the early 1600s or 1700s, because the people here could get to the sea by the river out through the East Alligator and the South Alligator River to the coast, and they would have seen these sort of things and come in and then painted them on the rocks here. Two paintings of early style guns are in a cave nearer to Norlangie. These grooves in the rock here would be rubbing grooves that were used to grind seeds from the grass around here, and possibly even the ochre they used in the painting, but more than likely it would have been used by the women when they were grinding seeds with the stone, something like this, but not this one of course, but they would rub the rock around like that to grind the seeds for their making sort of flour and little cake things. Because this was their wet weather camp. They'd stay underneath here during the wet season and that's probably when they did most of the cave paintings. There was some carbon dating done at Leyland Cave, or Leyland Rock, and it was placed at 5,000 years old, so these grooves could be up to 5,000 years old. Near a rocky escarpment called Little Leyland, we spotted something high up on a ledge. Visitors are only allowed in this area in daylight hours, and for good reason. This rock ledge has got a lot of bones and a lot of hessian here. This was a burial site for an Aboriginal, not sure whether it be a male or female, but it's been wrapped up in the hessian and put up here on the rock and left. The animals have been into it and pulled all the bones out, and birds have probably eaten the flesh that was there. There's not much left now except a few small bones like these vertebrae, a few finger bones, and the skull's gone, probably somebody's pinched it. But this is fairly high off the ground, as you can see, and this is the sort of place that the Aboriginals bury their bodies. They wrap them in hessian or bark in the old days and put them in places like this, all through this escarpment area. There's hundreds of sites like this, and hopefully there's a lot more that are not as desecrated as this one. The more obvious cave in Little Leyland has suffered from earlier visitors. An ochre-covered bone. That's all that's left of two bodies. I was here at this burial cave 10 years ago, and there was two skulls sitting there then, right there, looking out of the cave, plus a lot of other bones painted in ochre like this. Now they've gone. Some vandal's been here and pinched the bones and just left these few that are left, you know. It's one they didn't take them all. Seems an awful shame to think that people will come all the way out here to the Arnham Land escarpment, where you need four-wheel drive to get in, and steal the skulls that have been there probably hundreds of years. The only ones that are left now are the ones that are right back in the hills, where they're not accessible to the visitors that have stolen these bones. If they're watching this program, I hope they realise what they've done, because nobody now can see them. They come out here on a tour and there's nothing left, just the hole, which was once a burial cave. Only the spirits remain at Little Leyland.
Travel all over the countryside, ask the Leylands, travel all over the countryside, ask the Leyland brothers. Whatever it is that you want to see, ask the Leylands, no matter whatever that happens to be, ask the Leyland brothers.